I am live. I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. It is a novel by Joan Marshall Grant. She lived until 1989. She was English. And she wrote books about her previous incarnations, her previous lives. And 7 of them, and I've read them all. This one, The Laird and the Lady, is a novel she wrote. And it's published 1949, and it is the story of Rowan and Marylda. They are in his castle, Castle Cloud, and various happenings have been in the last chapter. We are here now in chapter 4, Christmas Tree. Through a casual remark of Alistair's, substantiated by the visitors' book at Darwin, Marylda found that Emilie had never spent Christmas at Cloud. This festival is not considered of particular importance in Scotland, where they celebrate instead on New Year's Eve, but both Georgina and Rowan were pleased when she insisted on at least having a party for the tenants' children. Anderson declared himself willing to decorate the house a week before he had intended. For his restored hothouses, the quantities of carnations ordered without stint, the 10 new gardeners over whom he now ruled had increased his previous acceptance of Marylda to the point of almost of idolatry. She woke early and crept out of bed without disturbing Rowan. The hall was spicy with the smell of evergreens, and garlands of holly replaced the reproachful stag hats which used to congeal the gaiety of more sensitive guests. She switched on the lights in the drawing room, a subdued glow under the pelmets of the white satin curtains. This evening there would be only candles. Candles on the trees which reached to the Adam ceiling. Candles in the wall sconces of Waterford glass between each of the 8 windows. Candles in the twin chandeliers which Mr. Grummet had found in red-gnawed trunks, abandoned since Thunder installed gas mantles. Smooth surfaces of pale green paint gleamed like peridots as a background for Venetian mirrors, and echoed the embroidery of the dress worn by an ancestress of Rowan's when she was painted by Alan Ramsay in 1747. The Christmas tree was brilliant with parcels, cellophane and tinsel, lacquered paper and bright ribbons, presents on the tree, presents half hidden by clumps of jonquil and scarlet tulips which seemed to grow from the bank of moss that spread below the branches. She had tried very hard to find out exactly what each child wanted, for the memory of her own disappointments was still at times uncomfortably real. Only Grummy had taken the trouble to choose her presents with care, instead of being satisfied if they were suitably and expensive. The puppy he gave her when she was 8 had made up for the scale model of an Atlantic liner that ran by real steam which her father had provided. His wigwam restored the childish dignity that had suffered by the gift of a French doll on her 11th birthday. Content that everything was ready for her first attempt at Santa Claus, she went to the dining room for a biscuit, there still being an hour before Elsie brought the morning tea. It was difficult to recognize the room as the one in which she had watched Rowan consume oatmeal on her first morning in Scotland. Instead of dark red paper, there was the original panelling, which had been found in the loft over the stables. Serge curtains had been replaced by coral silk damask. George and silver enhanced the Sheraton side tables, for Rowan had willingly agreed it need no longer remain in the strong room, now that there were plenty of people to keep it polished. 4 family portraits, one of them a Lili, reigned instead of the Victorian still lifes, which had been presented to the Village Institute, with the exception of an early Landseer that had been sold for a surprisingly substantial sum to a gallery in Glasgow. Neither Rowan nor Georgina had inquired how Marylda had disposed of Hector's white owl. Had they done so, she would have been at a loss to explain why she had burnt it and crushed the glass dome under a stone in running water. Marylda still found it surprising that Georgina had made no protest at the sweeping alterations. She did not know how difficult it had been for Georgina on one occasion, when she had decided to have the original four-poster bed, with the curtains of Charles II stump work put back in the Laird's room. Twice Georgina had seen it banished to the attics. Once by Emilie, to be brought back by Hector on his second marriage, again by his widow, who could not bear to sleep in it after she had drawn the curtains close to try to shut out the sound of the lament when his body was carried to the churchyard. Georgina heard Marylda come upstairs and undid the top button of her flannel pyjamas to draw out the Carey pearls, which Hector had given to her on their wedding day. She had worn them for 6 weeks to restore their lustre, dimmed by lonely years in the bank. She put the double row in their blue velvet case, wrapped it in tissue paper, tied the parcel firmly with pink satin ribbon. Even the ribbon held memories. It was part of the layette that Rowan's mother had chosen. She sighed, regretting that she had not been more tolerant of her daughter-in-law. Poor Deirdre, so colourless and so eminently suitable for Hamish. Deirdre had wanted the baby to be a girl, proving that she had no proper sense of responsibility. How typical of her to die of scarlet fever before her son was a year old. Marylda was back in bed before Rowan woke. "Happy Christmas, my darling," he said, taking from under his pillow the parcel he had wrapped for her the night before. She untied the tartan bow on which she had spent several anxious minutes carefully unfolding the layers of holly-patterned paper he had chosen at a stationer's in Inverness. She disclosed a red Morocco leather case stamped with the Carey arms. "Guess what it is," he said eagerly. Should she guess right? Yes, he had probably told her about the emeralds when he took some of the other family jewels from the bank to give them to her as a wedding present. "It's a necklace, an emerald necklace, because you know they are my favorite stones." He tried to hide his disappointment. "You're a rotten guesser. You'd better open it and see if you like rubies too." She hoped he did not notice that her hands were shaking as she opened the case. Oh, why had she been such a fool? Janet had told her the day when they had sorted the illustrated papers that Emilie had taken the emeralds with her. "I only pretended to like emeralds because I'm really a bit superstitious about them, and I wanted to be on the safe side. Oh, darling, how lovely. I never thought I should own a tiara, and such a magnificent one." She hugged him and then ran to the dressing table to try it on. As he watched her, his sudden flare of anxiety subsided. She couldn't be so gay if she had really been remembering the emeralds. No, of course she couldn't. She turned laughing towards him. "Do you like your wife in a tiara?" "Darling, no woman has ever looked so lovely as you do, with a jeweled crown and your hair loose and the rest of you so gloriously dressed in nothing. You ought to appear like this at the ball. In fact, I should demand it if I had the stamina to vanquish all the male guests in your defence. May the Lady of Cloud wear her tiara for breakfast?" He pretended to consider. "Only if she agrees to partake of the meal in bed. We will inform Georgina that we shall hold audience in our lit de parade. Why should you accept less homage than the Queen of France? Part of my present to you is so small that it could go in a matchbox, and I ran out of coloured paper, so I left the rest of it downstairs." He pretended to be disappointed. "But I love unwrapping presents. Couldn't I have had a little bit of newspaper and a foot or two of string?" "There's lots of string, but first you will have to find the clue, for your present requires a treasure hunt." He tore off the gilt paper and opened the green leather case. It held 2 gold keys, one with his initials, the other with her own. Again he joined in the game, pretending not to know what kind of keys they were. "The keys of your heart." "How can they be? I gave you those on a certain stormy evening in France." He jumped out of bed and pulled her up with him. "I refuse to be tortured by curiosity. Do we need more than a dressing gown?" She went to draw back a curtain. "Definitely more. It's snowing." "So it's an outside treasure. Shall we require a spade to find it?" "I hope not, unless the snow is very deep." Still wearing the tiara, She put on red fur-lined boots and a mink coat while he dived into a grey sweater and buckled his kilt. Hand in hand they ran downstairs across the courtyard. The double doors of the great barn were closed with a tartan sash. It's a very small key for such a large door. He pretended to search for a new lock in one of the knee-holes of the ancient oak. You have to untie the bow first, and you mustn't cut it, for Georgina lent it to me. A vast white shape loomed out of the dark cavern of the barn. That she had given him a Rolls-Royce silver grey with scarlet leather upholstery, perfect in every detail, even to his crest on the driver's door, he found less moving than that she had wrapped it in linen sheet and tied them on with scarlet cords. They took Georgina in the car with them, when, with a traditional offering of whiskey for the men, plum cake for the women, they made the rounds of every farm and croft on the estate. Whiskey and cake in quantity, for it would have been an insult to refuse hospitality, are not a judicious preliminary to... Whiskey and cake in quantity, for it would have been an insult to refuse hospitality, are not a judicious preliminary to Christmas lunch, but so that Mrs. McTaggart might not feel they neglected her turkey and plum pudding, the dogs were allowed to ignore the usual discipline and ate until even Angela politely refused and flung herself down beside Jock and Lassie in front of the fire. "Oh, more than lovely, wife, why are you so energetic?" groaned Rowan, who was lying full length on one of the drawing-room sofas. "Why must I be asked to go and see whether the blue crackers or the yellow look better on tables that stagger already under the weight of cake and jelly, and all manner of confections which would have inspired me to gluttony in my youth, and now instill awe not untinged with horror? You'll feel better when you see the children enjoying themselves," she said happily. "Before the evening's out, you'll be playing with the trains I'm giving to Anderson's eldest grandson, and probably wearing a paper hat. I'm allergic to paper hats. I haven't worn one since I was 2, and I immediately came out in a rash, and everyone thought it was smallpox, and the castle was in quarantine for 6 months, and several of the household starved to death. Then you can blow a squeaker. It's good for you to learn to be democratic. You don't believe in democracy any more than I do, you Santa Claus. Next year we might have reindeer," said Marylda. "I expect Grummy could arrange it, and they would be quite happy living in the park with the Highland cattle. I don't suppose it's any colder in Lapland or wherever reindeers happen." "I believe she means it," Rowan remarked to Georgina, who was standing on the step-ladder trying yet another parcel on the tree, an electric blanket for Mrs. McTaggart, who suffered from chilblains. "And why not? I should be delighted to welcome a reindeer. Or shall we have at least 2, so that they have someone to talk to until they learn the Gaelic?" At 4 precisely the children arrived, 73 of them. Marylda, who was not yet entirely familiar with Scottish punctuality, did not know that they had assembled in the courtyard and waited for the stable clock to strike. Silently they took off their coats, silently they trooped into the dining room and stood behind their chairs. It was Georgina who realized they were waiting for grace to be said before they sat down. Even after her hurried improvisation, there was no sign of the outburst of excited chatter that Marylda had expected. They ate with sober concentration, accepted what was offered, refused a 3rd helping of ice cream until they learned from the more adventurous members of the party that such indulgence would not be considered excessive. The cautions as to the good behavior which must be scrupulously maintained while at the castle began to seem slightly less urgent. 2 children pulled a cracker, others followed suit. But the excessively clean faces remained solemn even under paper hats. "Can these be the children who are usually so forthcoming?" thought Marylda as she led them into the drawing-room. It is possible that the influence of the Sunday kilt, the Kirk dress, can be so strong. The children arranged themselves in methodical ranks, girls on the left, boys on the right, Obediently they played oranges and lemons, musical bumps, hunt the slipper. Occasionally a hasty stifled laugh rang out, or a child yelped at a pinch, furtively delivered by someone who had threatened to make it disgrace itself at the party. Rowan and Marylda called the children to the tree to receive their presents. Surely, she thought wildly, they'll loosen up now. I should have had the tree first. Then they could have forgotten their shyness playing with their toys. Each child received its present and said, "Thank you, milady, thank you, Sir Rowan," and walked primly back to its place, carrying the parcel which it had made no attempt to open. The servants did the same, returning to stand in a group by the door. Marylda turned on the radiogram. At the sound of a Highland fling, a small girl began to jig up and down, until admonished by an elder sister. In a silence between records, the sound of the stable clock bore down on the frosty air. The children fell into line, processed up the long room. "Good night, milady. Good night, Sir Rowan. Thank you very much for asking me to the party." Each shook hands with the host and hostess. The candles flickered in the draught as the hall door, after an interval in which outdoor clothing was resumed, opened to release the guests. Marylda sank down on one of the sofas, trying not to burst into tears. "Darling, no wonder you were exhausted," said Rowan fondly. "But it was worth it. The children had the time of their lives." "Do you need to be sarcastic?" "Sarcastic? What on earth do you mean?" "Then patronizing, if you want to split hairs. I didn't believe that any of them, believe that anyone, least of all me, who is supposed to be good at this kind of thing, could possibly make such a complete flop." He called to Georgina, who had gone into the hall. "Come here and tell Marylda whether you think our guests enjoyed themselves." "Doesn't she know it?" Marylda stared at them resentfully. "Please don't try to comfort me. After all, what does it really matter? I happen to be silly enough to give several children a hideously boring couple of hours and choose such dud presents that they were not even worth looking at. But take no notice, next year I shall probably make a better show, if I've the courage to have any of those damned children in the house again." Rowan, instead of being contrite, roared with laughter, in which Georgina joined. "My darling, you sound like Santa Claus bemoaning because he thinks that no one gets anything down his chimney except a quantity of soot. What you've seen this evening is a collection of Highlanders enjoying themselves. Enjoying themselves so much that they daren't let anyone know how close they are to giving way to their feelings. If they'd let themselves go, they'd have kissed you instead of repeating the phrase which their parents have been teaching them to say for days, and that would have been disastrous." "You must be lying. Children couldn't behave like that unless they were miserable." Rowan saw this was an occasion on which demonstration was worth hours of argument. "Put on a coat, and you'd better wear gumboots, because you're going to do a bit of stalking, and the drifts may be deep." 10 minutes later they approached the barn, where the children had assembled. By the light of 2 bicycle lamps the parcels had been unwrapped. Railway lines were being linked for the speed of clockwork trains. A future professor of chemistry was making his first experiment with the vials of colored powders that had been contained in a wooden box. A red Indian was stalking a moose through a trackless forest. A small girl was holding her doll upside down and saying to her eldest sister, "It's not only that her eyes open and shut, but she got real breeks under her skirt." A boy who was already certain that he would become an engineer who could make a better bridge than the one that spanned a fifth or fourth was proving the fact to himself with a set of Macana. He paused long enough to say, "It's a lucky man the Laird is to have such a wife. She must have the sight to know that this is what I needed." "She was a princess in her own country," remarked the chemist with authority. "They don't have kings and queens in America," said the bridge builder regretfully. Anderson's grandson quelled all controversy with the assurance of empirical knowledge. "Of course she is a princess. Didn't I see her this morning wearing her crown?" "Satisfied, darling?" whispered Rowan, who was finding a crack in the wooden wall a chilly observation point. "So very honored." A and so more than usually certain that one needs at least second sight to understand our Highlanders.